So what I want to give you now, you have heard a lot about EMA, so what I want to give you is our perspective. And I will skip some of this because this is the history. You can read it for yourself. We had an interesting time about this topic. There is the Ombudsman is being mentioned here in a less than flattering way for us. You've heard about this paper that, and the author is sitting here and has just presented. So if you want to know, he has detailed all the experience. I'm not disputing any of the factual correctness of this interaction, if you may call it that way. So let's fast forward now, excuse me, and say this is where we're today. This is mid-2012. Today our position is clinical trial is not commercial confidential information. So, full stop. And I would say this is a step in an evolution. I don't take such a dim view on our world as some of colleagues apparently in this room. I think we've gone through an evolution of openness in this field of clinical trials. It started in the US with clinicaltrials.gov. You have ideally today to register a trial before you do it. We know that this is not always implemented in the best of ways. By the way, I'm hearing that industry is sort of responsive to this. The one sector that does not respond and comply is academia, because the percentage of trials by academia that are registered there are far below those of industry. Then we now have the next step where you should, or soon will, have to publish short summaries of your results. Then we have the access to documents, and as the Ombudsman representative just told you, that was retroactive availability, and we have implemented that, you know probably better than I do, 2 years ago roughly, and this is what enabled the Cochrane collaboration to do some of their studies. We hate that retroactive availability because it's hugely labor intensive. And one of the speakers was commenting that the FDA takes 2 years. I can tell you why. They apparently, and this is hearsay, they employ 100 people to redact. This is stupid work. This is unproductive, and this is in nobody's interest. It's certainly not in our interest. So, also for very selfish reasons, we have said, well, we would love to get rid of this stupid exercise because it's numbing. So, we want to go proactive. Why not? And we're also talking about public availability of raw data. Now, the devil is always in the detail, and the detail here is this little word raw, because if you say raw data, what are we talking about? Everybody will assume, and I do assume, this is individual patient listing, fine. But even there are so many layers of what is raw data that it's mind-boggling again. And also, for the sake of completeness, I should say, if we talk about data, raw data, whatever it is, we should not limit it to pre-licensing RCTs, while these have always been in the eye of the storm. There is pharmacovigilance data, and there will increasingly be observational data. I know that some people are skeptical of observational data, and I know that here I'm in the nest of RCT aficionados, but I also live in nests of observational data aficionados. So there are two worlds out there. Fine. What this, of course, raises is the specter of playing with data. And not everybody is in their comfort zone about this. Data is like children. We all like our own best, and we don't want strangers to play with them. And that is a reaction that is somehow understandable. That goes not only for industry, that goes very much for academic investigators. I spent most of my life in academia, and I know that my colleagues in academia are not too happy about that. So, but also that, I think, is part of an evolution that we're in the midst of. I recommend to you a book that came out last year by Mr. Nielsen, about reinventing discovery. And he sketches that path and said, in past, there was always a union between those who made the observation, the experiment, and those who analyzed it. And that has been the case in physics, in medicine, everywhere. And now this is, and there were exceptions, and actually the regulated products like medicine are the exception, where you had a third party, in that case the regulator, to look at it. But what he calls the future will be a new division of labor. We already see this, and I wasn't aware, it's in the book, that, for example, the CERN, the European radio, what's it called? Yeah, this, where they smash atoms. They get so many data that they're not, well, that's what they do. They get so many data that they're not in a position to analyze themselves. So they parcel it out to different universities and say, please analyze this for me. So there are precedents, and I think this is a normal evolution that we're seeing. The question now is this good or bad? And I've said good or bad for who? For drug development and for public health. And I see drug development as a positive thing to be supported. We need better drugs, we need new drugs, there are still untreatable diseases. So I think this is a public health good, this is a commons. We want to support public health and, and drug development in the interest of public health. So there are pros and cons. And I'll start with the cons so that I can end on a more positive note. First of all, there is the data protection issue. And the deeper you dig, unfortunately, the more complex the whole thing becomes. You would say, well, why is that an issue? We, as an organizer, as a regulator, we don't get names, and we shouldn't, and we're not interested. We don't need to know whether this was patient John Doe or John Smith. That is usually redacted out, and that's fine. But there are also issues of the possibility of retroactively identifying someone. Now, some of these are probably real, some of these are artificial. What I do expect is that there will be a debate around this when you go to individual patient line listings. Think of a very rare disease. The classic example is there is an ultra-rare disease. There are two patients in France. One is a young woman, the other is an old man. Can you identify them if you have age and sex? Yes, of course, in theory at least. As I say, I'm not taking sides in this. All I'm saying, please be aware that there will be a debate around that, necessarily. And we will have to ensure that we protect patients' confidentiality, one way or another. I understand you can engineer your way around it, but it has to be done. The other worry that we have is phantom risks and health scares, as someone labeled it. And our worry as an organization that should enjoy the trust of the public, because that's what we're here for, and if we don't have that trust, we don't have a role to play, is that we will be blindsided. We will be blindsided by academics who are hugely conflicted, and by the way, maybe we should reflect a bit on conflicts of interest. I understand that someone who holds a contract with the industry is conflicted, yes. But an academic who wants to further his own career is also conflicted. I'm conflicted. The ombudsman is conflicted. The investigative journalist is very conflicted. So could we perhaps agree that everybody in this room has conflicts of interest because we all go for our self-interest, and that's normal. So what we see is that a trial is published, and that was a real case. It was the, what was it? The narcolepsy thing with the flu vaccine. And we were asked in the morning by a journalist, what do you say to this? Why do you not withdraw the drug from the market? And we said, what? What are you talking about? Well, there is a paper in the Lancet. Oh, we were not forewarned. Nobody told us. So this is where we lose trust, and we're worried about that, and we think it's legitimate. So can we come up with a rule of engagement to manage that? This is text from colleagues at FDA, and I fully agree with that. We've entered an era of increasingly frequent publication of meta-analysis, some of which identify safety signals for drugs that are on the market, and that's so far so good. Usually, there is this urgent call to regulate to do something, withdraw this drug from the market. So, third-party publications, and I would say there are people in this room who have done this, for better and for worse, will drive the agenda. And drugs do come under attack, rightly or wrongly. So I give you an example where this could have gone wrong. There is a drug that was licensed based on, not on clinical endpoints, but on some symptomatic endpoints. Then there was a meta-analysis that came out and said the relative risk of cardiovascular events is 1.6, significant. And that is very typical. You find lots and lots of signals when you do secondary analysis. There are somewhere relative risk or odds ratios between 1 and 2. And this is a particular conundrum for us, because on the one hand, you could say this is serious, this is a public health issue, absolutely, if it was true. On the other hand, it's a weak signal, something that very often comes up if you do multiple analyses. It's an issue of multiplicity. So in that case, the company was conducting a randomized controlled trial with exactly those endpoints. So they, or we, or patients, or whoever, were lucky because that was disproven. It seemed to be a misleading meta-analysis. I'm not saying it was conducted poorly. I'm not in a position to judge. There is also statistical error. Maybe it was a case of statistical error. Maybe it was a multiplicity issue. I don't think we will ever know. In that case, that died down because of the results from the RCT. Where would we be with that particular drug, which I assume, I cannot know, but I assume it's a useful drug for patients. Where would be that drug if that study had not been underway? In future, this will be very difficult. As someone observed, and this comes from an Institute of Medicine's report, and I subscribe to that, once you have identified a safety signal, true or false, and there are many false signals, and we have to live with that, it will be very difficult to do the definitive trial. Why would you still expose a patient to a drug when you already like to believe, I don't say no, when you like to believe that this is a dangerous drug? So would we lose useful treatment options? There is a very real possibility. I think we shouldn't overplay it. We should be aware that this is a danger. Now, that was the downside. Now let me be positive. I'd like to believe that raw data, aside from the political transparency issue, and all this data that are hidden in our archives, in the company's archives, are an underutilized resource. And there is a lot to be gained from making that available to a much broader audience than is customary today. Because today, who has access? It's the company themselves. And I don't blame them, but they cannot do all the analysis. There is so much in there and that's peripheral to their interests. And we don't do anything because we don't have the capability and the capacity. So make it available to everybody, make it open science. And there are so many benefits potentially to be reaped. And I've just listed a few here. There are people who play with such data sets to come up with predictive models. When you do an RCT, what you get is, on average, these patients who received A fared better or worse than the patients that who received B, A versus B. It doesn't tell you much about should you allocate individual patients to rather A or B. But clearly there are patient variables that you could look at, and that could, if you had data-rich large sets, you could perhaps come up with such predictive models and say if the patient has these characteristics, give him rather A. If it has other characteristics, give him B. There are machine learning systems now that could take all these informations to glean that kind of results out of it. You could, in future, even envisage matching an individual patient in a physician at the level of patient care to match a patient history with the clinical trial data sets. There's methodology out there, and the physician would then be advised for this patient, the following course of action would be useful to consider based on the data we have, but for another it's a different one. And largely there is this big push now for what in Europe we call relative efficacy assessment. The Americans call it comparative effectiveness research. We all know that we need that. I don't believe the siren songs that the future is in active controlled trials for a number of reasons. I think we should learn something else. It's called indirect comparison. I know the people who wrote this. This came out a couple of months ago. By sheer chance, or, well, it's not chance, it's probably because the time was right, we authorized almost simultaneously, or within a short space, 3 anticoagulants that were all compared against warfarin. So what you have now is a common comparator. And you can now run some indirect comparisons and come up with information. Is A better than B, better than C, or what are the relative merits of these 3? Now, these people very clearly say if we had had access to individual patient data, we could have done a very different analysis than the one we did, which was available on summary data. So there is a lot of positives and potential gains in there. And I think we should avail ourselves as a society of those data-rich sets. So coming back to what is the next step for us, what are we going to do? We have made it known, and this was on our website, it still is if you dig down, that we will hold a workshop on access to clinical trial data and transparency, and that is on. And we're planning it for the 22nd of November, so roughly a month from now. Some of you, I understand, will be coming. I think Peter will be speaking there on a panel. I have to regrettably to say to you that we only have 200 seats because that's our largest conference room and we're oversubscribed. But
you don't. It's all full.
It's all full. But what you can do is either we will web stream it, but this is a technical issue. We're trying to get more places for web streaming. But it will also be recorded so you can see it on our website in December. It'll be fully transparent. So what is the purpose of that meeting? We want to listen. You will not hear a lot from us. We want to listen to all our stakeholders, and there will be industry, and there will be people like the ones in this group. And we are hoping that we will be informed from the stakeholders when we draft our future policy. How can we do it? What can we do, etc. And we want to establish a working relationship with those stakeholders who are willing to engage and want to help us in formulating all these policies. So, when I say policies, what do I mean? And we say, while protecting the decision-making process, we want to develop a number of policies, and these are the bullets here. Now, what do I mean when I say protecting the decision-making process? I accept this is a bit of code here. What we mean by it, we want to release everything on the day when the decision is made, not before. Why? We don't, as a regulator, we have an obligation to public health. We want to take our decision in peace and quiet. It should be science-driven. You can disagree with it, and you can say we got it wrong, that's fine. But what we don't want is, while we assess it, having newspaper articles, why this drug should be authorized tomorrow because it's so great, or in another newspaper, why this drug should never be authorized because it's so dangerous. So we want to make it available after the decision. Ideally on the day the European Commission says yes or no, whatever the case may be. Now, what do we want? What do we need to develop? First of all, standards for storing and sharing of data. You addressed that, and it's not trivial. We do not hold all the data today. That is not a secret. There is a lot of technicalities behind there. We will in future. We're developing that policy. But the format is not straightforward. The Americans have been battling with this. Is there a common data format? The answer is they're developing it, but it's going very slowly because and there are different formats. So to make use of these data will require a lot of technical work. I'm not an expert on this. This is not political. This is purely technical. Then about the level of data to be released. I said probably we'll go down to individual patient level, depending on how good we will be at protecting personal information. That is a key thing. We will have patients in the room. Patients will have to be involved in that, patient organizations. We will have to talk about quality standards. As I said, we are scared that poor quality, but even good quality, analyses will come up and will cause a health scare and will get everybody in difficulties. So can we talk about quality standards? Are there quality standards out there? You could, for example, envisage that anybody, and I'm looking at you, whether you think this is legally okay, everybody who wants to download that should, like, if I want to download an app from my iPhone, I have to click on something I agree. You could say, I'm aware that the following data quality standards are out there. If I do this, I undertake to comply with those standards. Click yes and fine. We can also talk about rules of engagement. We say there is open access, fine. But what we would ideally love to see is transparency being a two-way process. You want to have access to data, in this case from industry. It doesn't have to be industry, it could be from anywhere, with a view to second guessing, second analysis. Fine, you should have access. The world shouldn't be one voice, and there should be no monopoly on analysis. But shouldn't transparency be a two-way process? Shouldn't you tell the world, not us, but the world, what was your analysis plan? And I think what Peter said just rightly, then sometimes the primary endpoint mysteriously changes. Sometimes the analysis plan mysteriously changes. Well, that can go on even more in a non-interventional study, and I would call a meta-analysis a non-interventional studies. We all know that there are computer programs that you can set to find you a p-value less than 0.05. And you run it overnight, and you come in the next morning for breakfast, you got your paper basically. I have shown that this drug causes X, p less than 0.05. We want to guard against that because we think it is not in the interest of public health. So maybe could there be a way to say, two-way process, you get the data, but we want to see your analysis plan. If you don't submit it, that's fine, but we will let the world know that there was no analysis plan. So something along those lines. I'm not in a position to predict where we will be going. That's why we have those interactions with our stakeholders.